Jaap, Karan Singh from Secure Code Warrior, talking to us about taking a preventative, human-led approach to software security and embedding it into this developer's DNA. Away you go.
Great, thank you so much, Teresa. First of all, I just want to apologize, I can't be there in person. I actually haven't left Sydney. I think it's been almost a year now, which I'm sure other people can relate to as well. Maybe not so much in New Zealand, where you guys are running around freely. We've had a lockdown for a long time. And I realized, funnily enough, OWASP, typically when I've been to OWASP conferences, you get to learn a lot about the tools and technologies that are going to make your life easier. So I'm talking about the humans, the other side of that puzzle. And just 5 minutes before I jumped on, I realized the irony of my topic. I'm going to be talking about humans, but I can't be there in person. So it's a very dehumanizing way of delivering. But hopefully you like the message and you like the presentation. And let me just go to my next slide. So what we're going to be going through today is 5 main things. First, we'll touch on the ancient history of software creation, just set the context, the background a little bit in terms of where we are today, and then how do we go about this human-led approach. Talk a little bit about the transition that's happened in software development, the different methodologies that we've had, this ideology of DevSecOps, which I'm sure whether you're a developer or you're a security practitioner, a lot of people are jumping on board with this. We're talking about the human aspects of DevSecOps. How do we get those developers and the software practitioners really taking a human approach to this? And then talking about why security-aware developers really are the future. That's what we believe. What I believe, that humans really are, especially the developers, they're going to be that first line of defense for us, and then offer a little bit of tactical advice on how do we go from this dev mindset, this dev culture, to a DevSec culture and mindset within software engineering. So let's start by looking at the ancient history of software creation. And if you look at it, in the past, I think if you look at a decade ago or 2 decades ago, software development and security had pretty much no interaction. It was siloed work environments. Developers would do their job. They would be responsible for functional features, and security teams would come in and they would validate whether there were any sort of security bugs. They were very, very aware of any sort of software issues that developers had. However, unfortunately, the remediation advice they would give would make almost no sense to developers. It was as if they're speaking a different language. As a result, what you'd get is friction in the workforce. So anytime you've got a team that's always acting as the blocker, as the bad person who's telling you you're doing a bad job, it's not a healthy relationship to have. So you'd find that development teams would often delay code reviews, give AppSec as little time as possible to find any sort of security issues. And as a result, the cycle that you get into is bugs get discovered very late, oftentimes, unfortunately, even months after the feature is publicly released. And if we fast forward to today, how has that culture evolved? And for the most part, this is what I find. I work with a lot of application security teams, and as much as we're trying to improve this culture, we find that for the most part, there is still this dysfunction that continues today. Development doesn't really see security as their friends. We're still getting in each other's way. And a lot of times, if you ask developers, if you actually survey developers in your team, you would be surprised to learn how many times they don't see security as a priority. And the larger your organization, the more developers you have, the more watered down that message gets. And as a result, what you find is security is still being considered very, very late in the SDLC. I think anyone who's in the security industry, that's essentially the journey that we're all on today. We're all on this stage where we're doing security very, very late, and we're trying to find different ways to work with engineering to introduce security earlier in the life cycle. We're not there yet, but it's a journey that we're all on that we've taken. So security bugs are everywhere, and what we find is, whether it's 20 years ago you had something like SQL injection, or if you look at it today, it's pretty much in terms of conceptualization. It's the similar sort of security bugs, they just look different. So for all intents and purposes, what it seems like we've got this fundamental problem with this foundational lack of training and enablement around security education for developers. Now the question is, can we afford to go down this path? And we really cannot, because if you look at it, security bugs are harder and harder to get under control. We're seeing more and more code being produced every single day. So there's a staggering statistic, 111 billion lines of new code is produced each year. So that is not the technical debt that you're managing today. That is every year. That is the amount of new code that we're creating. There's more and more developers that are coming into the industry. There's about 25 million developers today. It's expected to almost double very, very soon. If you look at the number of zero-day cyber attacks as a result, they're estimated to reach 1 per day by 2021. And you'd think, hey, you know what, we need to make security a priority. We need to get more security practitioners in. But on the other side, we've got a supply problem. There just aren't enough trained security professionals who will come in and who can protect our organizations. And this trend, we're not seeing reversing. It just continues to grow. That divide of the amount of people that we need to protect us and the amount of supply that's coming out is just not up to the mark. So let's look at this metamorphosis of methodologies that's happened over time and how that has impacted software development and software bugs. And I think this is something that most people I would expect are familiar with. But essentially, if you look at this, you'll see waterfall, very long cycles, very distinguished stages. You're designing, you're coding, you're testing, and then you're deploying. If you look at Agile speeds up that process, right? So maybe you're doing code sprints every week, every 2 weeks. You make sure that you break things up into small chunks, you code them, you test them, and make sure you're delivering on a continuous speed. The thing that was being done later on was being deployed to production. If you look at DevOps, it really accelerates that cycle, right? How many times do you walk into your engineering groups and the KPIs or the goals that they set for themselves is not how many times a month do we deploy for a lot of teams, it's how many times a day can we deploy, right? Is it 3 times, 5 times, 10 times? And we're really finding that a lot of those technology companies that are the front runners, the ones that set the trend, that is a trend that they're following. They're making sure that every time there's a new value add that they've created for a customer or for their target market, it gets released to production as soon as possible. Yeah, if you look at that cycle, it was hard enough to do security when we were in the waterfall stage. But you could somewhat make sense of it, and you could say, hey, you know what? Maybe between that testing and deploy stage, let's try to throw a little bit of security in there. But as we move to these different stages, as we evolve our development practices, what we're finding is, yes, we've improved the process, we've improved our delivery speed to market, but security is nowhere in that life cycle. There's nowhere where we've said, hey, you know what? Even though we're deploying 5 times a day, this is how we're making sure that the code that we deploy is secure. That is still very much back of mind for most teams. So then people talk about DevSecOps, and I'm sure a lot of people here know about DevSecOps. It's this latest software development methodology, and it's about taking this DevOps process. It actually works really well. It's helping a lot of teams deliver things faster and making sure that we also put security at the forefront of every stage of the project. We make sure that every team is doing their part when it comes to ensuring software security best practice, whether it's your project management team, whether it's your product team, your developers, your QA, they're all playing a little bit of a part. But if we look at it, as much as anything, and similar to how it is with the Agile and with DevOps, as much as it is about tooling and making sure we've got the right tools and our tools are upgraded, so they're not these things that are monoliths that take a lot of time to run. We make sure that we're able to efficiently capture changes and test them efficiently from a security perspective. It's also a culture shift. We have to make sure that our engineers, developers that are coding, that are responsible for this DevOps process, they understand the importance of software security. And until that happens, it is going to be very, very difficult. We're going to face a lot of friction when it comes to producing more secure software through these latest methodologies. So how's DevSecOps changing the game? So if we look at it, that's your typical DevSecOps. So we've gone from that singular one stage after the other. We've gone into more of a loop with DevSecOps, where we're continuously building, we're coding, we're releasing code, we're deploying it, we're monitoring it, and then we're making changes as fast as possible. So how do we do DevSecOps at the moment? So teams that are trying to do this, how's it changed the landscape of software security? And unfortunately, when we go into organizations a lot of times, theoretically, yes, we all know what needs to be done. We want to embed security in every stage of the life cycle. But a lot of times, this is what we see. This is how we see things are being done. You've got developers, they write code, they are engaged with their deliverables, they're totally on board, they believe in the vision of the company. But then once it's been pushed to a repository, you build the code, you deploy it, it goes to production. To the developers, it still really just feels like it's just magical security fairies. They scan, they find, and they fix all this insecure code, and maybe or maybe not, they bounce back with an annoying hotfix. But as far as the developers are concerned, they aren't, and most of them aren't really aware of what's happening from a software security perspective. How are we really making sure that this code that we've just coded up, this new feature, does not introduce a security vulnerability and expose our application? And the question then becomes, is DevSecOps a game that developers want to play? Right? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. Yes, we want to do it as security practitioners, but what do the developers think? Because they're one of our main stakeholders when it comes to this. And it really comes down to the fact that we need to inform developers of the role that they play in these new methodologies. And we need to give them the time, the support, and the tools that they need to be able to meet these objectives that we want to get out of DevSecOps. DevSecOps isn't going to work if we're doing it as a security function in a silo. It really has to be a collaborative effort. We have to make sure that key goals are agreed upon, and development doesn't have just their own priorities, but they also consider software security a key priority. And really for us as security practitioners, I think it's a game of patience. This is what we see a lot of times, because we get security, we get how important it is, we know how important it is to secure our applications and the consequences if we don't. But it takes a while to get other people on board with that mindset and make sure that they truly understand the impact of software security. So we have to make sure that we give people the time to understand the importance of security early in the process and help develop that culture shift. And it's not something that's going to happen in one day. It's something that takes a very, very long time. And really, if we want DevSecOps to work, we need to work together to be the heroes that we need. So that's your AppSec team, and that's your developers. That is the only way we're going to get over the line. So now I want to talk about why security-aware developers are the future. Why are they this critical piece? You know, we talk about this human-led approach. These are the humans that we need on board most of all. These are our biggest stakeholders, and let's talk about why they matter. And I think this is something that a lot of us know about the security industry, is that there will just never be enough AppSec people to save the day. So in a typical organization, what we find is for every software developers, there's one application security expert. And I've worked with organizations where even this is not a good enough number. You often have 200, 300 developers, and you've got one application security expert or two people maximum, and they have to manage a plethora of applications. And what that essentially means is, unless you've got complete unicorns working in your application, there is no way they can be completely across every single stack that exists in your organization, be able to follow the right process, enforce the right security methodologies. We really need people in those individual software development teams to be on board and be able to carry out some part of that security function, be able to do low-risk security reviews, or be able to act as champions, enabling other developers, doing threat modeling, doing security by design. But let's say, if we could hire more people, right? So let's say we don't have a shortage of application security experts, and we just hire more people. And I've genuinely had developers asking that question, and it's not something that we think about as security practitioners. But when someone asks you that, it really makes you think and go, actually, yeah, that's a valid question that you've asked. That let's say we didn't have a shortage, let's just train more people to be application security experts and bring them on board. But we've still got a fundamental issue because most organizations just do not have a budget to hire more application security experts. It's not like suddenly, if you had more people, you could turn around and hire 10 more application security experts. Because all of that money that you're now spending on application security, it means you're taking away from somewhere else. So any new features, any bug fixes that are going to help you get in front of your competition, you're no longer doing that. You've just slowed down your rate of change. So even something like that is not quite feasible. So we really need to find a different way of working together. And if you look at security-aware developers, one of the things to note, and this is for any developer that's in the audience, is that security-aware developers are highly, highly sought after. And I believe that trend is going to continue to stay like that for a very long time, because a security-aware developer is a cut above the average developer. Because if you're doing secure code from the start, that means there are not bugs that you're introducing later on that have to be thrown back. And even from an efficiency perspective, a time perspective, you're actually being a more efficient coder, you're producing more quality code. And as a result, oftentimes what you see is these security-aware developers, so anyone who invests the effort and the time to train their developers, these developers end up being absolutely instrumental in that battle against cyber attacks and data breaches. And for you as a developer, you get presented with a lot more lucrative job opportunities. So if this is a field that you're interested in, you're thinking, hey, you know, how is this going to help me personally in my career? Dive right in. So I thought I'd talk about a little bit of a tactical guide. So hopefully you're on board with me. You get the why. You see, you know, hey, why developers need to be on board, why we need to take a human approach. The next question becomes, well, how do we actually do this? How do we go about making this move from dev to DevSec? What are the type of things that we should be doing? And I think one of the first things for us to do as a security team or as a business is really truly believe that security is a shared responsibility. We need our counterparts in engineering and in product and other parts of the team to understand that this DevSec mindset only really works if everyone's in it together, because it really does take a village to uphold the best security practice. We need our software developers to be security aware and not just worry about the quality of the code that they're writing or how fast they're able to deliver features, how performant their code is. These are often things developers worry about intrinsically, and they continue training to make sure that they're writing better and better code over time. We want to make sure that they also consider security as another facet of code quality. And this is something that we find a lot of teams that are at the forefront of this talk about. Security is no longer this separate thing that you're doing. You don't have code quality, then performance, then security. No, security is just another facet of code quality. So if you think you write quality code, well, that's only really true if your code is also secure. If your code is insecure, well, guess what? It's not actually quality code. And that's what we really want developers to believe. And ultimately, we don't want application security teams to be the ones that are taking ownership over these security vulnerabilities. We want developers and development teams themselves to take ownership over their own coding outcomes. We really want them to be aware of any sort of vulnerabilities that they're adding into their code and go and fix it retrospectively as quickly as possible. And this is not a new thing for developers. If you look at the transition that we've had in the quality assurance land, back in the day, you would have siloed teams where you have developers that would write their own code. You would have quality assurance teams that would go and test that piece of code. But then over time, we realized, hey, how do we make that process more efficient? How do we make things faster? How do we give people more ownership? And we started to see this trend towards unit testing and making sure that we had 100% code coverage over our code, right? And that allowed developers to then take ownership over the functional testing of their own code and make sure that any sort of code that they were putting out actually met the requirements of their product. And similarly, we want to do the same thing with security. We want to make sure that developers understand that the code they're writing, what the security implications are, and make sure that any sort of bugs that they can identify and they can rectify by themselves. From a security perspective, I think one of the most important things for us is to help nurture a highly supportive environment. So making sure that, you know, developers, they have lots and lots of different priorities. So we have to sure that we set KPIs for them in such a way. We have to work with leadership to make sure that their KPIs are also positioned around secure code. not just the speed of production. And one of the great things that I've seen a lot of organizations start to introduce now is this idea of license to code. So if I'm a developer, I've just joined this organization, until I go and I do all my required pieces of training, whether it's learning how to use GitHub or whether it's learning all of my other development tools, one of the other onboarding KPIs that you get set is making sure that you've got a baseline level of software security knowledge. So what that allows you to do is once you've done that, once you've got your license to code and you're contributing code to this organization, you can have some level of assurance that this developer is now security aware. They understand what software vulnerabilities look like and how they manifest in their own code. One of the things that you'll find as you try to transition to this DevSecOps model is even if your company is already doing DevOps, you're going to find there are going to be knowledge gaps in terms of what sort of tooling to use, how to go about understanding software vulnerabilities. So we have to make sure that we're ready to raise any sort of gaps in knowledge. And you know, oftentimes you'll find that if you throw back a pen test report or a SaaS report, some sort of security report to developers, it's hard to comprehend. It is not something that's easy for them to understand. So we really need to make sure that instead of overwhelming those developers, we're ready with the right training and we raise those gaps in knowledge before we start handing off more of that security function to those developers and give them ownership. And the other thing that we want our software developer leaders to do is to commit to a higher standard of security themselves. And they're really the ones that other developers are going to look to and make sure that, yep, this is this high standard that I should be following. And I think also importantly, as we work as collaborative teams, engineering teams, they are different. We make sure that we support each other. We believe in each other's success and everyone's working towards the same positive goals. So whatever the goal of engineering is, we make sure that the way the security function works, we also accommodate for their goals. If they want to move and scale and they want to get faster in their development, we make sure that we don't just act as blockers, but we act as facilitators and help them achieve their goals as well. One of the other things that you'll find is the best teams, and it doesn't even matter whether they're DevSecOps teams or just teams in general, highly performant teams continuously train and improve their skills. So we have to make sure that as the vulnerability landscape changes, we're training our developers. They're getting frequent security training, and also not just are they getting training, but we're actually giving them proper time to go and train. So if developers are asked to do their full daily job, and then they have to go and train on the side in their own time, you're going to get a lot of friction from developers. So making sure that training is considered a priority in your organization, you're able to allocate time, that's really important. Now, the problem sometimes I see is we're able to get time for training, but then if you're not training effectively, you're not training on the highest value things that are going to have the biggest impact in your organization, more often than not, that training time is going to get pulled away from developers. So make sure that any sort of training that you pull out is really on point and is critical for those developers. And when they go back to their daily job, they're actually able to practically apply that knowledge. I thought I'll show a really powerful case study that we've seen work out in the wild and kind of what the impact is of this human-led approach, what really happens when you empower developers. So it's a tier 1 US financial institution that I've worked with in the past, and their goal was to upskill their developers, and they want to make sure that they did it quickly, and any sort of training solution that they built out is scaled to hundreds of developers. And the goal really was, and I think it's very similar to any sort of goals of any AppSec function, is to reduce the costs associated with fixing vulnerabilities and introduce less vulnerabilities at the latest stage of the SDLC. But now this is where things get interesting. They wanted to do all of this. It's a tremendous goal to have, but they wanted to make sure that all of this was done without impeding the life of developers too much. I just want to make sure that we're not pulling developers away for a day or 2 days and saying, hey, let's now do DevSecOps training and talk about SaaS and that. We want to be more efficient. We want to make sure that we're not disrupting the flow of our technology teams. So what do? They ask their developers just for 3 to 5 minutes of their time, but they wanted developers to get into this training habit where they were training every single day. So whether you someone who takes public transport, you go and train on the bus, or maybe with your morning cup of tea, or when you're relaxing in the evening, but you find that time within your day, but you make it consistent every single day where you're going and training and learning about software security. And as a result, what they found is when they tested their skills before the start of this program and they tested the skills of the developers after the start of their program, they found a 60% increase in the secure development capability of these developers. It's massive, 60% increase. And what that really means, what that translates into in the real world is that there's less late stage bug fixing and there's significant long-term savings because you're not introducing bugs that end up in production and to later come back and fix. And then lastly, if you look at successful DevSecOps teams, they have the right set of tools for the job at hand. And the way I really look at that is I think a lot of companies will go and buy an AST tool, whether it's SAST, IAST, which I think is great. I think it's super important for us to have that stack. But I think the most important piece of the puzzle, and this is what I always tell everyone that I work with, is make sure that it's not a siloed decision. It's not something that you decide in security and say, hey, this is a tool that's going to work best for us. If we want this to be something that's going to live within the CI/CD pipeline of the developers, it's a tool that they're going to be looking at to verify and remediate the vulnerabilities. They're an important stakeholder. Let's make sure they're part of this discussion and we make sure this is going to work for them. Is this something they can put into their pipeline, or does the remediation advice this tool give, is that something tangible that developers can do something with? So it's super, super important to get them involved. As part of that, one of the other things that you also want to be doing is we all need security policies. One of the ways that we guide our teams is to make sure that we set out certain policies that we want application teams to follow, and then make sure that they're adhering to it. But is there better ways that we can go about doing that? So instead of giving them, a big paper PDF document, is there something that could be living in their environment? Is this a Jira workflow that we can set up? Right, so that's a lot more friendly to developers. They understand that. But again, the way to get to that is by getting them involved in that journey, identifying what the gaps are, what's slowing them down, and making sure that you work with them to give them the right set of tools. So just to summarize, if we look at it, kind of where we started, traditionally the relationship between application security and development, it's been quite strained, and it's led to less than favorable outcomes. That's sort of what brings us to today. If you look at the number of vulnerabilities that we have out in the wild, you have 100+ vulnerabilities that exist in the world. And if you look at any sort of application, I think it's very, very rare to find applications where the number of vulnerabilities is consistently going down. More often than not, what you end up with is an application, it has vulnerabilities. You pick some of the key vulnerabilities that you need to go and fix. You almost have no choice because of the risk that they introduce, you go and fix them. But some of those lower risk vulnerabilities, you really just leave in there. That's your engineering technical debt they've decided to leave in there. And you get into this vicious cycle. More and more vulnerabilities, so our applications are not aging too nicely. So that's sort of where we are today. And if we look at DevSecOps, it offers a methodology to make security a shared responsibility, and it does it through a combination of tooling, cross-team collaboration, and training. And I think the most important stakeholders for us, if you want to be successful with DevSecOps, with embedding software security into our company's DNA, is it's through developers. We've got to make sure that our developers are security aware, they understand the importance of software security, and they really are the rock stars that are going to take us forward in our organization. And if you're a security aware developer, you're that rock star, you should know that you're highly, highly sought after, your skills. And because of that, you should be tremendously proud of the value that you bring to your organization. That's it from me.
Thanks, Jaap. Some great take-home ideas there for building better teams. Anybody have any quick questions? Great. Okay, I'll hand over to John.
John's not ready yet.
No, John's not ready yet. Just
really? No questions at all? None online?
Oh, one question. Okay, can you give an example of one of the 3 to 5 minute challenges that you mentioned?
Oh, it can be absolutely anything, right? I think ideally you want it to be as specific to your stack as possible. So one of the great examples that I've seen is you take a vulnerability that just happened in your stack and you say, hey, why did we have this high risk vulnerability? And you can present that as a question to your developers. You can do it in Slack, you can do it in a mailing list, and really let people come back and learn about that vulnerability. So you can say, here's a bad piece of code in our application. Go and learn about this vulnerability. This is called SQL injection, or this is called cross-site scripting. They go and learn about it, and then that's a great teaching opportunity to show them what the best-in-class way is to fix that vulnerability in that particular language stack, because you've just gone and fixed it. So you can provide some very, very specific remediation advice for your stack and go, hey, this will be the best way of fixing this vulnerability.
Okay, one more question from online. What's one thing to keep in mind if you're seeking to become a more security-aware dev?
One thing to keep in mind.
Don't do anything stupid.
I think, to be honest, I think the biggest thing as a developer is it's going to be mindset. So making sure that you consider security as a facet of code quality. So I think if you're a developer, one of the things that you'll continuously do is making sure that you're writing better code from a quality perspective. So you'll go and learn about it. It's a continuous journey. And one of the great things, if you look at any developer who's improving over time, is they will go back to their code from 3 months ago or 6 months ago or however long ago, and they will be shocked at the quality of that code. And they go, I cannot believe I wrote that code. And that shows your journey that you've improved as a developer. So I think it's similar sort of thing with security. So if you consider security the same thing, it's a facet of code quality. You look at security by design, like how can I write better applications that are secure by design? So we're not bolting on security at the end. As a developer, that's a good journey that you can take and go and learn more about it. Like how do I do security by design? So when you come back to your code, not only are you looking at it and saying, I could have written that code in a more performant way. We're also looking at it and saying, from a design perspective, maybe I could have done X, Y, and Z, and that would have been a way better design and would not have introduced that sort of vulnerability that I had.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, everyone.